My name is Evan Carter. I'm 42 years old, and for most of my adult life, the woods were the only place that ever really made sense to me. I spent 8 years in the Army, 75th Ranger Regiment, and when I got out, I couldn't stand the noise of the city. I couldn't stand the crowds. So I took my severance, bought a small plot of land in the foothills of western North Carolina, and made a living doing the one thing that brought me peace: wildlife photography. It was a good life, quiet. I knew the patterns of the forest, the way the light fell through the canopy at dawn, the sound of a deer stepping on a dry leaf from 100 yards away. I was comfortable there. I was confident. I thought I knew what was in those mountains. The trip was an annual thing. Every fall, a few of my old platoon mates would come up from Bragg or Benning, and we'd lease a remote cabin deep in the Pisgah National Forest for a week of hunting and forgetting. It was more about the camaraderie than the kill. This year, there were 5 of us. There was me. There was Cal, my old squad leader, steady as a rock and the best damn tracker I've ever known. Corey, our comms guy, who was now a gear-obsessed private security contractor. Jake, quiet and intense, who had been our machine gunner. And then there was Brian. Brian was the new guy, Cal's brother-in-law. A real estate agent from Charlotte, all fresh gear and no idea how to use it. He was loud, told bad jokes, and treated the whole thing like a corporate retreat. He didn't belong, but he was Cal's family, so he was our problem. The cabin was at the end of a 10-mile gravel road that was more pothole than road. It was an old hunter's shack, solid log construction, with a stone fireplace, a generator for electricity, and no cell service. Just the way we liked it. We spent the first day unpacking, sighting in our rifles, and listening to Brian complain about the lack of Wi-Fi. Cal just clapped him on the shoulder and told him to breathe real air for a change. It felt normal. It felt good to be back with my brothers, in a place where the world couldn't touch us. We sat on the porch that evening, drinking cheap whiskey and watching the sun dip below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The air grew crisp and cold. The familiar sounds of the forest at dusk started up. The crickets, the call of a barred owl, the distant rustle of some small creature in the undergrowth. Everything was exactly as it should be. The first sign that something was wrong came after dark. We were inside, sitting around the fire, the low murmur of our conversation filling the small cabin. It was just after 10 o'clock. Suddenly, the normal night sounds just stopped. It wasn't a gradual fading. It was like someone flipped a switch. 1 second, the woods were alive with the chirps and calls of 1,000 different things. The next, there was absolute ringing silence. We all noticed it. The conversation died and we looked at each other. Corey, ever the pragmatist, just shrugged. "Probably a predator moving through," he said. "Bobcat, maybe a bear." We all nodded, but the explanation didn't feel right. The silence was too profound, too complete. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like a blanket smothering the world. Then came the sound. It started low, a deep, rhythmic thudding from somewhere out in the darkness. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't the sound of an animal walking. It was too heavy, too deliberate. It sounded like someone was hitting a massive tree with a sledgehammer, slowly and methodically. We all went to the windows, peering out into the blackness beyond the porch light. We couldn't see anything. The thudding continued for maybe a full minute, echoing through the valley, and then it stopped as abruptly as it began. The silence that followed was even more unnerving than before. Brian tried to break the tension with a joke. "Must be Bigfoot chopping firewood," he chuckled, but his voice was tight. No one laughed. Cal moved to the gun rack and pulled down his Mossberg. He didn't say anything, just racked a shell into the chamber. The sound was loud and final in the quiet room.
Probably just some kids messing around, Jake said, his voice a low rumble, but he was checking the magazine on his rifle. We knew better. No kids were coming 10 miles down that road to bang on a tree in the middle of the night. Just as we started to relax, thinking whatever it was had moved on, another sound ripped through the night. It was a scream. A high, piercing shriek that sounded like a cross between a rabbit in a trap and a woman's terrified cry. It was a sound of pure agony, and it was close. It went on for 3, maybe 4 seconds, and then it was cut off with a wet, gurgling crunch. And then, once again, that suffocating silence. This time, nobody offered an explanation.
We just stood there, weapons in hand, listening to the pounding of our own hearts. We stayed up all night, taking turns on watch, but we heard nothing else. The forest remained dead quiet until the first birds of dawn dared to break the spell. The next morning the world seemed normal again. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the events of the previous night felt like a shared nightmare. Brian was back to his usual self, dismissing it as a mountain lion taking a deer. "Nature, red in tooth and claw, boys," he said with a grin, a little too brightly. The rest of us were quiet. We decided to check the trail cameras we'd set up on the game trails leading to the clearing around the cabin. There were 4 of them, expensive units I used for my photography work, bolted securely to trees. We found the first one about 200 yards from the cabin, or what was left of it. It wasn't torn down or clawed up like a bear would do.
The thick plastic housing was crushed, shattered into pieces, as if it had been put in an industrial press. The metal security box it was in was bent and twisted. Most disturbing of all, the small SD card was gone. Not on the ground, not in the shattered remnants of the camera. It was just gone. We found the other 3 in the same condition. Each one was systematically destroyed, the memory cards meticulously removed. Corey knelt by the last one, examining the tree it had been mounted on. "Look at this," he said, pointing to deep gouges in the bark, 6 feet off the ground. They weren't claw marks. They were too clean, too parallel. It looked like someone had dragged a garden rake made of steel down the trunk. "No bear did this," Cal said, his voice grim. "This was deliberate. Whatever it was, it knew what these cameras were, and it didn't want its picture taken." We walked back to the cabin in silence.
The easy camaraderie of the day before was gone, replaced by a low-grade, simmering anxiety. We decided to stick together, hunting in pairs and staying close to the cabin. The forest didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt watchful. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden shape. Every gust of wind through the leaves sounded like a whisper. I found myself constantly scanning the tree line, my hand never far from the pistol on my hip. I felt like I was back in Afghanistan, walking a patrol through a village where I knew every eye was on me, waiting. That night, the siege began in earnest. We barricaded the door with a heavy table and made sure every window was locked tight. We sat in the main room, the generator humming outside, casting a pool of yellow light into the clearing. For hours, nothing happened. The normal sounds of the forest had returned, and we started to think we had overreacted. Brian was even starting to needle us about being spooked by a raccoon.
Then, around midnight, the generator sputtered and died. The cabin was plunged into absolute darkness, the only light coming from the dying embers in the fireplace. Corey and I immediately grabbed our flashlights. "Stay put," he commanded, his voice calm and authoritative. "Jake, cover the back. Evan, with me." We moved to the front windows, our flashlight beams cutting sharp cones through the darkness. The fuel line. Whatever was out there had been smart enough to go for the generator first. It had cut the fuel line. This wasn't an animal. This was intelligent. we heard a soft scraping sound from the porch. It was the sound of our heavy wooden rocking chairs being moved, slowly and deliberately, away from the front door. Then came a new sound, a low, wet sniffing, right at the base of the door. It was loud, powerful, the sound of a huge animal trying to catch our scent. I could hear it inhaling, a deep, guttural rasp, followed by a chuffing exhale that vibrated through the floorboards. We all stood frozen, our rifles trained on the door. Brian was breathing in short, panicked gasps. "What is that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. A heavy weight suddenly slammed against the front wall of the cabin, shaking the entire structure. Dust rained down from the log beams above us. It hit the wall again, a solid, meaty thud that sounded like a wrecking ball. Then we heard it at the back, hitting the kitchen wall. There was more than one. They were testing the building, looking for a weak point. I moved to a side window and risked a quick look, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had my night vision monocular, a piece of surplus gear I always brought with me. I pressed it to my eye and scanned the darkness. For a moment, I saw nothing but the familiar shapes of the trees and rocks in the greenish glow. Then, something moved at the edge of the clearing. It was crouched low to the ground, a large, dark mass of a thing. As I watched, it stood up, and it kept standing up. It unfolded itself from the shadows, rising onto two legs. My breath caught in my throat. It was huge, easily 7, maybe 8 feet tall. The shoulders were impossibly broad, wider than any man I had ever seen. The arms were long, hanging down almost to its knees, ending in what looked like massive, clawed hands. The proportions were all wrong, like a grotesque caricature of a human form. It turned its head, and my blood ran cold. Even in the grainy green image of the monocular, there was no mistaking the shape. It was the long, tapered muzzle and pointed ears of a canine, a wolf, or a German shepherd, but scaled up to a monstrous size and placed on the body of a bipedal giant. It scanned the cabin, its head moving with an unnerving, intelligent purpose. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man in a suit. It was something else. Something that shouldn't exist. Before I could process what I was seeing, before I could even shout a warning, it took one long, fluid step back and melted into the impenetrable darkness of the trees. It was there, and then it was gone. "I saw one," I whispered, my voice hoarse. I lowered the monocular, my hand shaking. "It's on 2 legs. It's huge." Corey looked at me, his face a grim mask in the flickering firelight. "How huge?" he asked. "Bigger than a bear," I said. "And it's not a bear. It looked like a wolf standing up." Brian made a choked, hysterical sound, somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "A werewolf? You're saying it's a werewolf?" Cal shot him a look that silenced him instantly. "Shut up, Brian. Evan saw what he saw." The creatures outside seemed to know we had seen them. The probing stopped. The woods went quiet again, but this time it wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the quiet of an ambush. The silence of a predator that knows it has its prey cornered. We spent the rest of the night pressed against the walls, listening, our senses stretched to their breaking point. Every creak of the old cabin, every skittering mouse in the walls, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through us. We were trapped. We were being hunted. And we had no idea what we were up against. Dawn had never seemed so far away. The third day dawned gray and overcast. The creatures had apparently retreated with the light, but we knew they were still out there, watching from the cover of the dense forest. We were exhausted, running on adrenaline and stale coffee. The mood in the cabin was grim. Brian was on the verge of a complete breakdown, muttering to himself in a corner. Jake was methodically cleaning his rifle, his face an unreadable stone mask. Corey was trying to formulate a plan, spreading a topo map out on the floor. "The truck is a no-go," he said, tapping a point on the map. "They've had all night to mess with it. I guarantee the tires are slashed. The road is our only way out, but it's 5 miles of open ground to the main highway. We'd be too exposed. We have to go overland, through the ridges. It's harder terrain, but it offers more cover." Cal nodded in agreement. "We wait for first light tomorrow. We can't risk moving in the dark. We board up the windows, reinforce the doors, and we hold this position until then." It was a sound plan, but it meant surviving one more night of terror trapped in that box with those things circling outside. We spent the day preparing. We tore planks from the bunk beds and nailed them over the windows, leaving only small slits to see and shoot through. We wedged the remaining furniture against the doors. The cabin became a dark, claustrophobic tomb. We were low on food and water, but nobody had an appetite anyway. Late in the afternoon, Brian finally snapped. He'd been drinking whiskey from the bottle all day, his fear curdling into a sort of drunken belligerence. "I can't take this," he suddenly yelled, jumping to his feet. "I'm not going to die in this damn box. I have to take a leak." Cal stood up and put a hand on his shoulder. "Brian, calm down. Use a bottle. Nobody goes outside." Brian shoved him away. "I'm not pissing in a bottle. They're gone. It's daylight. I'll be right back." Before any of us could stop him, he unbarred the back door and stumbled outside, zipping down his pants as he headed for the wood line at the edge of the clearing. Cal swore and grabbed his rifle, starting after him. "Brian, you idiot! Get back here!" I was right behind him, my own rifle up and ready. We were maybe 20 feet from the cabin door when Brian screamed. It was a short, choked-off sound of pure, abject terror. He had made it to the edge of the trees, and something was there, waiting for him. It rose up from the shadows of a rhododendron thicket, a solid wall of dark, matted fur and muscle. It was the creature I had seen in the monocular, but seeing it in the flat gray light of day was 1,000 times worse. It was a physical impossibility. The powerful, digitigrade legs of a canine bent at the wrong angle for an upright creature. A torso that was brutally thick and powerful, covered in shaggy, blackish-brown fur. Arms that were too long, corded with muscle, ending in 5-fingered, almost human-like hands, tipped with thick, yellowed claws. And the head. It was the head of a nightmare wolf, massive and blocky, with a long muzzle full of yellow teeth. But the eyes were what stopped my heart. They were not the eyes of an animal. They were a pale, luminous amber, and they were filled with a terrifying, malevolent intelligence. It was looking at Brian with an expression of cold, clinical curiosity. In one of its hands, it held Brian's rifle. The steel barrel was bent into a perfect U shape, as if it were a piece of soft clay. The creature let out a sound that was not a growl or a roar, but something deeper, a guttural vibration that shook the very air. As it did, 2 more figures emerged from the trees on either side of it. One was slightly smaller and leaner, its fur a lighter brown. A female, I guessed. The other was lankier, more awkward in its movements, but still easily the size of a full-grown man. A juvenile. My stomach twisted. This wasn't just a monster. It was a family, and we had trespassed on their territory. The big one, the male, tossed the bent rifle aside with a flick of its wrist. It took a step toward Brian, who was frozen in place, his face a white mask of horror. That's when our training kicked in. "Fire!" Corey yelled from the cabin doorway. Cal and I opened up simultaneously. I put 3 rounds from my .308 into the creature's center mass. I saw the impacts, saw the fur fly, but it barely staggered. It grunted, a sound of annoyance more than pain. and turned its burning amber eyes on us. The attack was a blur of coordinated, terrifying violence. The male charged, not at us, but at the cabin, covering the 30 yards of clearing in a few bounding strides that were impossibly fast. It hit the front wall like a freight train, and the entire structure groaned in protest. The female and the juvenile split up, circling the cabin from opposite sides, their movements fluid and predatory. We scrambled back inside, barring the door just as a massive clawed hand smashed through the wood where Brian had failed to replace the barricade properly. The next few hours were a chaotic hell. Corey took charge, his voice cutting through the panic. Fields of fire. Jake, back window. Evan, front. Cal, you roam. Don't waste ammo. Controlled pairs. We were soldiers again, falling back on the muscle memory drilled into us years ago. But this was different. We weren't fighting men. We were fighting something stronger, faster, and terrifyingly smart. They didn't just throw themselves at the walls. They were strategic. The female used a large rock as a tool, hammering at the boards we'd nailed over a window until they started to splinter. The juvenile climbed onto the low-slung roof, and we could hear its heavy claws scrabbling on the tin, looking for a way in through the chimney. The big male was the director, staying back in the shadows, communicating with the others through a series of low clicks and guttural huffs. It was watching us, learning. They used psychological tactics too. One of them started mimicking Brian's scream, a perfect, chilling echo of his last moments, followed by a sound like laughter, deep and raspy. They were trying to break us, to make us panic, and it was working. Jake was firing wildly into the darkness, chewing through his ammunition. I had to grab him and yell in his face to get him to calm down. The turning point came when the female finally smashed through the boarded-up window in the small bedroom. It clawed away the splintered wood and began to force its massive head and shoulders through the opening. Jake was closest. He emptied his pistol into its face at point-blank range. The creature shrieked, a sound of rage and pain, and thrashed wildly, its claws tearing deep gouges in the interior walls. As it recoiled, Cal charged forward, swinging a heavy splitting axe he'd grabbed from beside the fireplace. He brought it down with all his strength on the creature's exposed shoulder. There was a sickening crunch of bone, and the creature let out a piercing howl. It ripped itself backward out of the window, leaving a smear of dark, thick blood on the frame. But we had no time to celebrate. The chaos had been a diversion. While we were focused on the female, the juvenile had slipped around to the back door, the one Brian had weakened. It hit the door with its full weight, and the frame shattered. The door flew open, and the lanky creature was inside the cabin with us. It moved with a gangly, horrifying speed. It went for Jake, who was still fumbling to reload his pistol. Its long arms shot out, claws extended. "Jake!" Cal yelled. He didn't hesitate. He threw himself between Jake and the creature, shoving his friend out of the way. Cal wasn't fast enough to get clear himself. The juvenile's claws tore across his chest and stomach, ripping through his jacket and flesh as if they were paper. Cal screamed and went down in a heap. Corey and I turned our rifles on the creature. We fired, again and again, pouring rounds into it. It was like hitting a brick wall. It staggered back under the impacts, snarling and snapping its huge jaws, but it wouldn't go down. It backed out through the broken doorway, its intelligent eyes filled with hate, and disappeared into the night. We were alone again, in the wrecked and blood-spattered cabin. I rushed to Cal's side. It was bad. It was worse than anything I'd ever seen in combat. He was torn open from his shoulder to his hip. He was trying to say something, but all that came out was a bloody froth. His eyes were wide with shock and pain. Corey, our trained medic, knelt beside him and ripped open his shirt. He took one look and then looked at me, shaking his head slowly. There was nothing we could do. There was too much damage. Cal grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. He looked at me, his eyes pleading.
Evan, he coughed, blood speckling my face. My girls. Tell them. He couldn't finish. A shudder ran through his body, and then he went limp. His eyes stared blankly at the ceiling. Cal was gone. We sat there in the silence, the smell of gunpowder and blood thick in the air. We had lost. The cabin wasn't a fortress. It was a tomb. And we had to get out.
Dawn, Corey said, his voice hollow. In 2 hours. We leave at first light. He looked at Cal's body, then at the shattered door. We can't stay here. They'll be back. The decision was brutal. We couldn't take Cal with us. We couldn't take Brian's body, which was still out there in the dark. We could only save ourselves. The weight of that choice settled on me like a shroud. Leaving a man behind was the one thing we were trained never to do. The last 2 hours of darkness were the longest of my life. We could hear the creatures moving outside, their fury replaced by something else. We heard a low, mournful howling. The female, I realized. They were mourning their wounded. It made them seem even more terrifying, not just mindless monsters, but a thinking, feeling family unit capable of grief and rage. It meant their attack wasn't just predatory. It was personal. As the first hint of gray light touched the eastern sky, we made our move. Corey, Jake, and me.
We gathered what was left of our ammo, a single bottle of water, and a compass. Corey took point, I took the rear, and Jake, who was pale and moving like a zombie, was in the middle. We slipped out the broken back door, leaving Cal lying by the cold fireplace. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The escape was a nightmare march. We moved as fast as we could through the dense woods, our boots slipping on wet leaves, branches tearing at our clothes. The air was cold and damp, and a thick fog clung to the ground, limiting our visibility to a few dozen feet. For the first hour, we thought we were clear. There was no sound of pursuit, only the noise of our own ragged breathing and the frantic beating of our hearts. Then, I saw it. A flicker of movement on the ridge to our left, paralleling our course. A tall, dark shape moving silently through the trees. It was the big male. It was watching us. It wasn't chasing us. It was escorting us off its land. I didn't tell the others. There was no point.
We just had to keep moving. We saw them a few more times, glimpses through the fog, the female limping heavily and the juvenile, both keeping their distance, just silent, menacing shadows in the mist. It was a terrifying game of cat and mouse, and they were letting us go. They had won. They had defended their territory, killed 2 of us, and were now herding the survivors away like stray cattle. I don't know how long we walked. Hours. It felt like days. My legs were numb, my lungs burned, and my mind was a fog of grief and exhaustion. Finally, through the trees, I saw a break in the canopy. We stumbled out of the woods and onto the gravel of the logging road. It felt like reaching solid land after drowning. We weren't safe, not yet, but we were out of their immediate territory. We half walked, half ran the rest of the way down the road, constantly looking over our shoulders, but we saw no more sign of them. When we finally reached the paved highway, we collapsed on the shoulder. We must have looked like ghosts, covered in mud and blood, our clothes torn, our faces hollowed out by trauma. The first car that came by, a beat-up pickup truck, screeched to a halt. The driver, an old man with a weathered face, just stared at us, his eyes wide. "My God, boys," he said, "what happened to you?" He drove us to the county sheriff's office in the nearest town. It was a small, sleepy place. The deputy at the desk looked at us with a mixture of pity and suspicion. We were taken into separate rooms and gave our statements, I told them everything, just as it happened. The sounds, the smashed cameras, the creature with the canine head, the siege on the cabin, the deaths of Brian and Cal. I knew how it sounded. I knew it was insane, but it was the truth. Corey and Jake told the same story. We were combat veterans, trained observers. We were credible. It should have mattered. It didn't. The sheriff, a portly man named Davis with tired eyes, listened patiently, nodding in all the right places. But I could see the disbelief in his face. When I finished, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Son," he said, his voice gentle, like he was talking to a child. "You boys have been through a terrible ordeal. It's not uncommon for the mind to play tricks on you under that kind of stress." The official story was written before they even sent a team up to the cabin. It was a bear attack. A freak, unusually aggressive black bear. Or maybe a grizzly that had wandered hundreds of miles from its natural range, they speculated. They found Brian's body, what was left of it. They said the damage was consistent with a bear. They found Cal inside. They said the bear must have broken into the cabin after we fled. They found our shell casings, the broken furniture, the blood. A desperate, chaotic fight with a bear, they called it. The bent rifle? It must have gotten caught in a rock and twisted when Brian fell. Every piece of evidence that pointed to something else was ignored, explained away, or buried. We were treated as victims, but also as liabilities. Our story was a wild, inconvenient truth that they didn't want to deal with. They held us for 2 days, officially for our well-being, but I knew it was to make sure we all got our stories straight. Their story. When they finally let us go, the message was clear. Forget what you think you saw. It was a bear. About a week after I got home, I got a phone call. The man didn't give his name. He just said he was with the state's Fish and Wildlife Service and had read my statement. His voice was old and raspy. "I'm not supposed to be making this call," he said, "but I've been working these mountains for 40 years. You're not the first. That area you were in, there's a reason the locals call it the Hush Hush Woods. People go missing up there. Hunters find strange things. Most of them are smart enough to keep their mouths shut." He paused, and I could hear him take a long drag from a cigarette. "Listen to me, son. You got out. That makes you luckier than some. Stop talking about what you saw. It won't do you any good. It'll just bring you trouble. The official report says it was a bear. You let it be a bear. And you never, ever go back up there. You understand me? There are some things in this world that are better left alone." He hung up before I could ask any questions. That was the only validation I ever got. A whispered, anonymous warning that confirmed I wasn't crazy, but also sealed my isolation with the truth. It's been a year since it happened. I don't go into the deep woods anymore. I can't. The peace I once found there is gone, replaced by a constant, gnawing fear. I sold my photography business. I can't stand to look through a telephoto lens into the shadows, terrified of what I might see, looking back. I dream about it almost every night. I dream of amber eyes and impossibly long arms. I wake up covered in sweat, the sound of Cal's last breath in my ears. The guilt of leaving him there is a weight I carry every single day. I delivered his last message to his wife, but I couldn't tell her the truth. I told her the lie the sheriff gave me. It was a bear. It felt like the ultimate betrayal of a man who saved my life. I still have the footage. Before we left the cabin, I had a small camera mounted on my chest rig. It recorded most of the fight. It's chaotic, shaky, filled with darkness and muzzle flashes. You never get a clear look at them, just glimpses. A long, furred arm, a flash of amber eyes,
a silhouette that is too big and moves too fast. It's not proof. It wouldn't convince anyone. It just looks like a panic-fueled firefight in the dark. But I watch it sometimes. I watch it to remind myself that it was real, that I'm not insane. I'm telling this story because I feel like I owe it to them, to Cal and to Brian. Their names are just statistics now, 2 more victims of a freak animal attack. But they were killed by something else, something ancient and intelligent that lives in the dark spaces of the world we think we've conquered. People need to know. Not everything has been discovered. Not every shadow has been explained away by science. There are things out there, deep in the mountains, in the places where the roads end, that are older and stronger than we are. So if you're ever out in the woods and you hear a sound you can't identify, or the forest suddenly goes unnaturally silent, don't try to rationalize it. Don't be brave. Run. Just run. Because you don't want to see what's watching you from the trees. You don't want to see what I saw.